The police asked me to keep one detail out of every statement I gave them. They weren't trying to protect me, and they weren't protecting the investigation either. The detectives simply said that if the public learned exactly how the victims had all been approached, they would either dismiss it as impossible or spend the rest of their lives becoming suspicious of every helpful stranger they met on the motorway. I agreed because, after everything that happened, I wasn't sure which outcome would be worse. I've driven articulated lorries across the country for almost 20 years, and if there's one thing every experienced driver learns, it's that routine is what keeps you alive. You stop for fuel at familiar places, check your mirrors every few seconds without thinking about it, inspect your tires whenever you pull over, and never ignore a mechanical problem, because 40 tons moving at motorway speed don't forgive mistakes. That routine is exactly what someone spent years studying. The first time I noticed the man was during a fuel stop just after midnight. Rain had been falling for hours, and the forecourt reflected every overhead light until the concrete looked like black glass. Most drivers hurried inside for coffee before getting back on the road, but one man remained standing beside an old white panel van without buying anything or speaking to anyone. He wasn't staring at me. He was watching the lorries, not the drivers. The lorries. I remember that because his eyes moved every time another truck entered the service station, almost as though he was reading something written across each trailer. When I climbed back into my cab, he looked away immediately. I forgot about him within minutes. 3 weeks later, I stopped at another service station nearly 200 miles away and saw the same van parked beside the boundary fence. It wasn't the sort of vehicle people remembered easily because there were no company logos, no unusual paintwork, and no obvious damage apart from a cracked headlight. The only reason I recognized it was because I had seen the driver carefully wiping rainwater from the registration plate during my previous stop. Again, he wasn't doing anything illegal. Again, he left shortly after I did. I only started paying attention after another driver mentioned seeing the same van in 3 different counties over the space of 2 months. We laughed about it over coffee because it sounded ridiculous that anyone would spend so much time driving between motorway services for no apparent reason. That conversation stopped being funny 6 days later. A driver named Martin failed to arrive at his delivery point outside Leeds. His refrigerated trailer was found parked neatly in an emergency refuge area with the engine switched off and the hazard lights flashing. His wallet was still inside the cab, his overnight bag hadn't been touched, and the driver's door was standing open as though he intended to climb back inside a few moments later. There were no signs of a struggle, no skid marks, no blood, no damaged property, nothing. Police searched the surrounding woodland until dawn without finding a single clue. Over the following months, 2 more drivers disappeared under almost identical circumstances. Different companies, different routes, different ages, but every abandoned truck had been left safely off the carriageway with its load untouched. The cargo was never stolen. Neither was the fuel. Detectives quietly asked haulage companies for CB radio recordings from vehicles equipped with digital systems, hoping someone had captured unusual conversations before the disappearances. They found one detail every victim had in common. Minutes before stopping, each driver had received a calm radio message from someone claiming to be another trucker. Every message was believable. Driver, you've got smoke coming from your trailer brakes. Mate, your rear tire looks flat from here. I think you've lost one of your marker lights. Nothing dramatic. Nothing urgent enough to create panic. Just enough to convince an experienced driver to pull over and check. The voice was always male. Always calm. Always sounded like someone who had spent years behind the wheel himself. Police later confirmed those radio calls came from equipment powerful enough to reach several miles across the motorway. By then, I had already heard the same voice. It happened just after 1 in the morning during heavy fog. Visibility had dropped so badly that every vehicle ahead appeared as a pair of blurred red lights floating in darkness. Then my CB crackled. Blue refrigeration unit heading north. Your near-side trailer doesn't look right. I'd stopped before the next bridge. The voice wasn't rushed. It sounded concerned and professional. For 1 second, my foot moved toward the brake pedal. Then I remembered something. Nobody had overtaken me for nearly 15 minutes. Nobody should have been able to see my trailer. Instead of slowing down, I checked every mirror. Half a mile behind me, barely visible through the fog, was a white panel van. It stayed exactly the same distance back, never gaining and never falling away. I didn't stop. I drove straight to the next motorway service station where bright floodlights covered every parking bay. The van continued past without turning in. I watched it disappear into the darkness. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The next morning, detectives arrived at the transport depot, asking for me by name. Someone had broken into my parked lorry overnight. Nothing had been stolen. Nothing had been damaged. Whoever entered had moved only one thing: my driver's logbook. When the forensic team returned it, they asked me to open the final page. There, in handwriting that wasn't mine, was a single sentence. "You finally noticed me. That makes you different from the others." The investigation eventually led police to a rented lockup containing motorway maps, CB radio equipment, dozens of high-visibility jackets from different haulage companies, and handwritten notebooks documenting hundreds of drivers' routines over nearly a decade. Some entries were chillingly ordinary. Always buys coffee before fuel. Calls wife at 22:15. Sleeps with driver's window slightly open. Checks straps every 2 hours. My notebook contained 43 pages. The final line had been written only 2 days before police searched the lockup. No longer predictable. Continue observing. The man responsible was arrested months later after another driver reported someone posing as roadside assistance. But investigators could never determine how many journeys he had spent quietly watching from a distance before deciding who to approach. I've never forgotten what the detective told me after the trial. He said predators like him don't rely on strength. They rely on routine. Every habit you repeat eventually becomes something another person can learn. I still drive at night. I still cross the same motorways. But whenever a stranger warns me that something looks wrong with my truck, I don't pull over because of what they say. I pull over because of who they might be.